Joe Wheaton is going to give us an overview of kind of the Western states and how he's seen it, because he's been working in so many different states. So thanks, Joe, and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jackie, and thanks to the organizers and all the great presenters thus far. I'll focus kind of like we did with the other ones on Utah, but as I'm going through, try to, like Jackie said, bring together some of the common elements. Today, I'm representing Utah State University, and we have a Beaver Ecology Relocation Center I'll talk a little bit about that works in partnership with the Division of Wildlife Resources in our state. They are the State Wildlife Management Agency. And as we heard from other states, the beaver are managed as a fur bearer, a nuisance species, and for their restoration potential as a restoration agent. So it's that sort of that triad that we see that's quite common. What I'd say is a little bit and then, like other places, there are other partners, other agencies, some state, federal, and lots of organizations that are interested in beaver for some of its restoration potential it can help us with. What's a little bit distinctive in Utah is fairly early on, beaver management plan was developed. It was passed in 2010. And this was largely Mary O'Brien's efforts, kind of leading a group of trappers, different stakeholders, and different representatives from within the Division of Wildlife Resources. And the goal of the plan was to maintain healthy, functional beaver populations in ecological balance with available habitat, human needs, and associated species. And so the plan was pretty progressive in terms of, actually highlighting the role beaver play as a restoration tool, and using, living with beaver sort of coexistence strategies, and also explicitly allowing live trapping and translocation. Now, a lot of those things have been done in various guises in lots of different states, even going back, hundreds of years. What's different here is having an explicit policy and explicit plan for beaver, as opposed to a broader brushed agency remit, like we heard from Wyoming and also from Idaho, from Jerry and Jamie, where then it's a very logical interpretation of that broad policy that beaver can play a role. So that's one thing that's a little distinctive. It's important when we start talking about beaver, and especially if we start thinking about their dam building activity that we're interested in using as a restoration tool, there's a lot of different strategies. One of the easiest is the sort of promote and protect, and so this would be, both the coexistence strategies as well as areas where they already are. What can we do to conserve those populations? That can go as far as maybe a temporary or even permanent trapping closure, though trapping pressure in a lot of areas is not really that big of a deal. And we've seen the trappers associations actually be some of the best partners in some of this work. There's a lot of areas where people are doing restoration and then realize beaver make that restoration better. And so just looking at that is a good thing. It's just a perspective shift. And then there's the translocation stuff we've been hearing about. And some of this is areas where the landscape can support beaver dam activity, but there aren't currently beaver. And we have to recognize that if we're trying to maximize the parts of our landscape and riverscapes where beaver could help us in improving the health and the resilience of those landscapes, there's a lot of places, localities they've been extirpated, particularly in dry parts of the West where we have sort of isolated drainages. The odds of getting natural dispersal back into those are extremely low, especially as capacities are sort of depressed on, easier living on some of the the bigger rivers. They're not reaching capacity in there, which would cause them to spill out into some of these more marginal areas. There's a lot of places where, even though beaver could do good, until you get a handle on, for example, grazing management and having riparian resources available, translocation doesn't make sense. And one thing I haven't heard mentioned yet this morning is that there is this paradox of the places where we want to translocate beaver currently aren't places that have the deep water that would be in the dams that they provide. And so so that's a situation where we might use things like beaver dam analogs to provide some safety net when we release them, and give them some choices. There is a big emphasis in a lot of places, and I feel guilty for this, on mimicking beaver dam impacts with BDAs and artificially maintaining them. I think we should just discard that sort of stuff in general, because if there isn't a clear pathway to how beaver dam activity can take over, this is just short-lived, you know, sort of games. But like I said, one of the simplest things, a sign like this and a temporary closure, we've seen huge successes within different parts of Utah, in just, you know, relaxing in places where there's been trapping pressure, and getting those populations to rebound. In some cases, you can reopen those, or in some cases, keep those closures on, depending on kind of what the local perspectives are. Utah did update their plan in 2017 based off of kind of seeing, well, there was good intent in the original policy. It actually called out that it should be reviewed and looked at. And so they went through, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it. There's a link here. And one of the things that was changed, we have a tool that sort of tries to predict both where beaver might build dams, as well as where there might be potential, you know, conflicts with different land uses and infrastructure. And so they didn't say you have to use the model, but take the logic of that and use that to assess where different strategies make sense. So don't go dumping beaver in a place you want them to improve, but there's no resources or realistic chance of beaver actually making a difference in that landscape, because the resources just aren't there to get them started. Some of the biggest challenges, and I think, you know, these aren't specific to Utah. In every Western state, beaver they tend to be managed by the fur bearer biologist. And they have to manage them for these three sorts of purposes. And depending on who that person is and how busy they are and how many other bigger problems that they're dealing with, even in a state like Utah, where you have these nice policies, it's an unfunded mandate. And there's within most of these state wildlife management agencies, Utah's the same. You know, the fur bearer biologist usually sits in a wildlife section. You've got folks in aquatics and in habitat section that want to see beaver everywhere, but you know, their budgets are also ring fenced. And so the poor fur bearer biologists and then their delegates at the region are stuck dealing with all the nuisance calls with no real budget to deal with that typically. As well as people saying, hey, we need you to, you know, be going and promoting this stuff. And it's been a real problem in terms of how to actually get this stuff going. It tends to, the examples of success almost always are because one stubborn individual within the agency figures out a way to make it happen. And that's great and it's wonderful, but if we want these things to scale up, I think we do need to look at some more sustained funding lines to make it easier for folks to do. We even heard the anecdote from New Mexico. So that's important. Also, you know, translocation facilities, and I'll show you an example in a second, are great, much like, you know, the Methow sort of pioneered. There was actually early examples up in Wyoming, examples from some of the tribes up in Washington, Yakima Nation, etc. But those serve a small region. And so like the southern region in Utah actually has, you know, a translocation facility in Cedar City, and they're doing a great job. We've got one at Utah State, where we've been sort of serving the northern and northeast region. And then we've also got a mobile facility, but there's three sort of parts to translocation. There's the getting the animals, then there's dealing with the quarantine, the health checks, working with the state vet, et cetera. And you need a place to do that. And these are big states. And so one facility probably isn't enough. So ways that people have kind of been overcoming these things are the same old stories of conservation: partnerships, bringing in outside funding to fill in and plug the gaps, et cetera, et cetera. With support from our college and from the Division of Wildlife Resources and other interested agencies, we've got this Beaver Ecology and Relocation Center, and one of the facilities is this Beaver bunkhouse. And that's worked well, because breaking these things out, the trapping part, we can enlist the help of volunteers, particularly local trappers, even other agencies, once they get certified by the state. And the state does need to maintain control and oversight of this. But then the holding facility is something the state was rightly much more sort of, cagey about, because they need to make sure that that's not just, anything goes, and that's done following appropriate protocols, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we had a little bit of an easier time because we were, seen as a sister state agency, being the university in that sense. And then, then there's the translocation. And, right now we're sort of moving on the order of 60 to 100 beaver a year. But the funding is fundamental, because when someone has a nuisance problem, whether it's real or perceived, they need to call a number, and someone needs to respond and get out there immediately and treat it with the seriousness that it is for that individual. That's how you build the sort of trust. And, that requires either people to, you can't sustain that off of volunteers. You need to pay people to keep that going. So I just want to show you this. Don't worry about the sound so much, but this is a fake beaver dam, a very bad little beaver dam analog that we built. And these are a couple of translocated beaver that we were moving out to a system in Grouse Creek where they were extirpated from. And the point here, so here's the beaver sort of inspecting the dam, looking at our shoddy workmanship, going, okay, I think we'll make that better. But a lot of the release sites that people release them into, the reason they split are because you're not giving them that deep water cover that just makes them so much more comfortable immediately. You're just abducting them, putting a bag over their head, and then dumping them out in the middle of nowhere. And so their instinct is often to move. And so we find building a series of BDAs makes a big difference. And you'll hear Jay Wild talk about the difference that made later in the conference. So anyway, this is a couple of months later. Those beaver were released in one BDA here. There was a handful of beaver dam analogs in this reach to give them choices. And then they expanded the footprint of that within a couple of months out to the yellow area is being either flooded, overflowed, et cetera. And now they've actually, a few years later, they've expanded out to the whole valley bottom margin in this reach. And we've actually moved quite a few beaver up in these systems, and they're moving all over the place up there. So I think it's important with beaver, wherever we're talking, is, thinking about if we're going to do translocation, or if we're going to build fake beaver dams, that's an act of mimicking, but to promote really quickly beaver dam activity. And we can promote beaver dam activity in places beaver already are. They may not be building dams, but they're opportunistic. And so there are things we can do there, but the long-term goal needs to be towards some sort of self-sustaining activity by the beaver. And, we have to recognize the role that the state wildlife management agencies play in this, and have some empathy for their situations, which are, even when there's the willingness, the interest, et cetera, if the funding isn't there, or if some of the mechanics in terms of removing some of the barriers aren't there, it can be really, really difficult. So that's all I've got, and be happy to hear what folks have to say in the Q&A.
Wow. Thanks very much, Joe. That was a really great way of summing up a lot of what's happening in Utah and other states. All of these presentations have been so helpful. and are providing a lot of resources for other folks that are attending this summit and are dealing with some of these issues and thinking about how to solve some of these issues. So now you have a lot of resources here with these 8 speakers to be able to reach out to them. So thanks very much for that.